All right, everybody. Hope you're doing well this evening. Welcome to Dudes Talking, episode 58. With me this evening, I have an esteemed researcher and a dear friend, George from cavdev.org, for us to discuss two big cases. One, George was able to obtain the Richard Hamlin court documents. So we're going to rediscuss the curious case of Sid Siemer again, as well as George's extensive research into JonBenet Ramsey murder case. George, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. How are you, John?
Doing well. I'm glad definitely to do this with you, man. I've been a lot of people have been asking for it. Everybody loves to have you on. I love to have you on too. You're one of the few researchers out there that I can completely trust, and I want to appreciate you joining this evening.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm always glad to be on this program. I think, these discussions that we have are, and that you have with other researchers too, are pretty much unparalleled in the YouTube conspiracy research community.
Yeah, and it's the same. Yeah, it's the same. When I first came across your work, and you were actually doing investigative journalism, which very few people actually actually do. So, so let's start with the Richard Hamlin court documents that you were able to get a hold of. George, what did they show? Was Richard Hamlin telling the truth? Was Sid Siemer what everybody's claimed that he was? Was he involved in the Cabazon Indian reservation? Was he involved with the finers, which I'll ask that question later in a minute? Were you able to determine any of that from the court documents? Was he involved with child trafficking in the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States government at the highest levels? Were we able to determine if those claims made by Hamlin were correct based off of the documents, or were they fabricated? What was gleaned from you reading through those documents?
So not every single claim that Richard Hamlin made was confirmed, but several of them were, and I would say that none of them have actually been disproven. We really just still have more research to do at this point. Just to give people background on the Richard Hamlin and Sid Siemer case, if they didn't see our last episode, basically, Richard Hamlin and his wife Susan Hamlin, they were both prominent attorneys in the El Dorado area in Northern California. They both had a pretty idyllic life, multiple kids, seemingly happy marriage. They've been college sweethearts, and around 2000, early 2000s, things just started going wrong in the house. Susan started having some mental breakdowns. For example, leaving the kids unattended in the car at one point, and she began, struggling with what was going on. And she eventually, according to Richard Hamlin, began recovering memories of incest at the hands of her father, Dr. Sidney Siemer. And Sid Siemer was a pretty, renowned, plant biologist. He worked in subjects like pesticides and plant growth regulation and those sorts of things. He worked for various chemical labs. He was, a consultant, and considered an expert for the state of California to testify on issues like this. So he was a reasonably well-established guy, and Susan began remembering that she had been molested by Sid Siemer as a child from a very young age. And according to Richard Hamlin, he began working with her to help, her recover these memories and eventually gain the strength to confront her father. And this basically, this led to an escalation. Her father essentially started threatening legal action if they kept talking about this. Richard Hamlin would, go around his hometown pasting flyers calling him a molester. It really started to escalate. And finally, in 2004, Richard and Susan both went to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office and made a report where Susan talked about all of this. And it was a pretty harrowing story about her own abuse and also the even more disturbing fact that, or claim that she had been molesting her own children as well, her and Richard's children, at the behest of her father to induce them into this network. And she made the statement to the police. The police were suspicious. They asked Richard to leave the room and then asked her, on her own about what happened, and she repeated the same story. So the police came to the determination that regardless of what the truth was, the Hamlin children were in an unsafe environment and had to be removed. So while all this was happening, some 2 days later, something happened with Susan. The pressure got to her in one way or another because she then recanted everything that she had claimed and said that no, my father didn't abuse me and I didn't abuse my kids. Richard, my husband, beat me into making these claims. I'm a victim of him, and none of this stuff is true. The police then took her word for it, arrested Richard Hamlin, and they indicted, ultimately the prosecutors in El Dorado County indicted him on charges of domestic violence and torture, that's claiming that he had tortured his wife into making these claims of incest. So for a while, it wasn't exactly clear one way or another who was telling the truth in this case. Richard Hamlin insisted that the original claims by Susan of being molested by her father were true. And in the course of investigating this, he and his brother Bradley Hamlin ended up essentially discovering, or claimed to have discovered at the time, that Sid Siemer worked in Indio, California, which is in Riverside County, in 1982, which just happens to be the exact time and place that there was a major spook operation ongoing at the Cabazon Reservation in Indio, involving people like John Philip Nichols, Michael Riconosciuto, Jimmy Hughes, Philip Arthur Thompson, all sorts of oddball, and covert operative characters like that, involved in weapons deals and biological warfare and modifying the Promise software, all sorts of those scandals that Danny Casolaro was looking into before he was suicided. So discovering that Sid Siemer worked on the reservation when all this stuff was going on really perked up their ears. They started getting in touch with other people like the infamous Ted Gunderson and his friend Michael Riconosciuto, who then claimed, "Oh yeah, I knew
Wait,
Siemer."
now, George, Ted Gunderson's not our guy. Hold on now. Hold on. That's not what everybody else says on the internet. I know we talked about Ted Gunderson a lot, but I just, once a counter intel pro agent, always a counter intel pro agent.
Well, exactly. And if you read Sherry Seymour's book, The Last Circle, basically acknowledges that Ted Gunderson and Michael Riconosciuto and another character named Robert Booth Nichols, like an arms dealer and CIA asset, they were all sort of in business together, trafficking narcotics. And this was just a couple years after Ted Gunderson had left the head of the Los Angeles FBI and suddenly gets into drug trafficking. So clearly he was a spook character, and we know that. And much of what these people say you have to take with a grain of salt, but certainly, when if Riconosciuto makes this claim, it's not something you can dismiss out of hand because he really was there on the reservation. You just have to be skeptical and see if it was actually, find more evidence to see if it was true or not. So ultimately, they were the claim that Sid Siemer was involved in all of these intelligence activities on the reservation, and that was why he had been essentially, why he was seemingly being protected, why the law enforcement decided to go after Richard Hamlin instead of acknowledging that Susan's initial claims may have been true. Now, what Richard Hamlin claimed, because he was able to get some of his writings out and posted on the internet during the trial, was that he had, for his defense, assembled a compelling case to prove that Susan's original claims were true. And the reason for this is, well, if the prosecutor maintains that Susan was beaten by me into making these claims, and I can prove that the claims were true with independent evidence, then their case of me beating her falls apart, because why would he beat her into saying something that was already true? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So he claimed in his articles online that he was able to find corroborating witnesses proving that Sid Siemer was a pedophile. And basically, he even named some of them. He named one of them was Susie W. in Oregon, who was one of Susan Siemer's childhood friends, and basically Susie W. supposedly witnessed Sid Siemer standing over Susan at night, like during a sleepover while she was crying. And then there was also another girl who had now grown up, and a woman named Jenny Love, who testified supposedly that she herself had been groped by Sid Siemer at another sleepover with her and Susan. So basically, you had these two independent witnesses more or less saying that, saying independently that Dr. Sid Siemer was a pedophile, and that make it very difficult to claim that Richard Hamlin beat Susan in making these claims, especially because she, of course, denied in her testimony ultimately that Sid Siemer had ever abused her and claimed it was all a fabrication. So, at this time, basically what I had sort of realized was, okay, if Richard Hamlin's telling the truth about this, then it does seem that there's a pretty compelling case against Sid Siemer and in favor of Richard Hamlin not being guilty of what he was charged and ultimately convicted of. But we don't know that. I mean, he can say anything he wants and post it online. We don't know if it's true. In keeping with the motto of this channel, what you actually want to do is go out, find the documents, and read them. And ultimately, since our last episode at the end of February, that is what I did. I did order the whole Richard Hamlin court file from the El Dorado County Superior Court, got the documents a couple weeks ago, and read them. And although there certainly is more to discover and investigate, it appears very clear that pretty much everything that Richard Hamlin claimed about his defense strategy was true. He did have witnesses testifying that Sid Siemer was a pedophile and independently corroborating it, and he introduced evidence that Susan had indeed been abusing their own children.
Interesting. Was there anything else that you were able to um, ascertain through reading the documents, or was there anything that you were able to uncover? Of course, my biggest question was there any mention of the Finders, which have been linked to Sid Siemer being a possible member of the Finders, which is important for me to ask this question, since I'm investigating them. Did you come across anything? Any Marion Petty? Anything at all?
Unfortunately, nothing about the finders. I still have no idea
Rats.
where that claim came from. It may have been Reconasciuto. And if Rachel Begley, who was she was the daughter of uh, one of the people, Ralph Boger, who, along with his friend Fred Alvarez and girlfriend Patty Castro, they were killed in a triple murder in 1981 on the Cabazon Reservation when they were about to blow the whistle on all these spook activities. And Rachel Begley had been investigating this for a while. She claimed to have evidence that Siemer was somehow linked up with the Finders. Unfortunately, she's more or less disappeared at this point. I've tried contacting her, been unsuccessful. So nothing about the Finders definitively in these documents. There are some names that Michael Reconasciuto mentions who are associates of Sid Siemer. He claims are associates of Sid Siemer, and it's possible that these people might be some kind of Finders connection. He claims that these people were all involved with him in sexual abuse activities on the Cabazon Reservation, that they were essentially some kind of cult, more or less. Now, so that's a possible connection. There's definitely a lot more to investigate, and anyone who wants to see these documents, go to the CabDef page on the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture. Scroll down to the section called Finders Connection, because that was what originally drew me to this case in the first place too, seeing if there was a Finders link, but it quickly became a whole thing onto itself. And go down to that section. I have the documents from the El Dorado County Superior Court linked. Unfortunately, at this time, there is nothing, there's nothing about the Finders, but there certainly is a lot of valuable material. And actually, John, I mean, if you don't mind, if you can start screen sharing and actually visit some of these documents, you could even show them live on the stream if you want, because there certainly is a lot of valuable stuff that came up. You know, there were multiple sources indicating that Sid Siemer did indeed work at Indio in 1982, just as Susan had claimed in her statement to police. There is even a letter that Susan had written on June 9th, 1982, which I should note is before she ever met Richard Hamlin in the first place, back when she was still going by Susan Siemer, talking about how she and her father were staying on the staying in Indio doing something. It didn't specifically mention the reservation, but at the same time and place. There were there were some investigative documents that Ted Gunderson had done, and of course that kind of taints everything. But for whatever his statements are worth, he claims to have interviewed Sid Siemer, who confirmed, you know, who basically yeah. Yeah, Ted Gunderson, he has reports sort of summarizing his interviews with Sid Siemer, with one of Sid Siemer's children, Glenn Siemer, and with Michael Reconasciuto. And of course, it's Gunderson, so who knows if this is credible? But in general, what he claims is that Sid Siemer basically says openly, "Yeah, I worked at Indio for multiple years. I was working on grape ripening." He allegedly confirmed to Ted Gunderson that he knew George Wayne Reeder, and George Wayne Reeder, the developer who was on the Cabazon Reservation and involved in many of these schemes, very likely linked to organized crime and intelligence. So that would sort of be an admission from Sid Siemer, if indeed it's true, that he was linked up with these people on the reservation. Glenn Siemer also corroborated the claim of Sid Siemer working in Indio. He mentioned a cold storage shed, which is exactly where Susan had claimed that she was abused at. And then there was Michael Reconasciuto's statement where he mentions all of these people who were involved with Siemer. He claims that Sid Siemer was introduced to him by Peter Zukoski, who owned a an arms dealer in Indio called Armtech,
Yeah.
and he was the husband of the mayor of Indio, Regina Zakowski, and that was one potential finder's link just because he's one of those eccentric types, artists and everything, might have some connection, and it's a lead worth following, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, all three of these investigative reports by Gunderson were introduced as exhibits by Hamlin, but also the letter that Susan sent was introduced as an exhibit, and that certainly is not tainted by Gunderson. That is compelling independent proof that Siemer was there in Indio at the same time and place that all this stuff was going down. And then more importantly are the multiple statements from basically multiple statements indicating that they had these two defense witnesses lined up. There was Susan Wilson of Oregon, aka Susie W., who I mentioned, as witnessing Siemer abusing Susan. And then there was also Jenny Love, who is now going by the name Jenny Love Hamilton, who would testify that she had been abused, that she had been molested by Sid Siemer. So these two witnesses who Richard Hamlin claimed were defense witnesses are indeed real. And it was good to get confirmation of that for the first time. And then perhaps most startlingly of all is and this is honestly one of the most disturbing things that I saw in this, and that is kind of saying a lot. One of the exhibits that Richard Hamlin introduced at trial was an assignment filled out by his kindergarten-age son named Alec. And this was sort of an assignment where basically what you would fill in, like, I wish my best friend, or like, I wish my teacher, I wish my mother, and like essentially you would fill in the blanks for all of these. And in the blank for I wish that my mother, he filled in, I wish that my mother would stop licking me, which is absolutely disgusting. But that is what he filled in multiple years, even prior to this whole situation blowing up. This was documented that he filled it out. This was introduced as Hamlin as an exhibit, and it corroborates what Susan claimed in her initial police statement, and then later recanted that she, quote, gave flicks to Alec's penis with her tongue. So, yeah, Ugh. Exactly. So we have evidence here, corroborating evidence that Susan did indeed abuse her own children, which again makes it rather absurd, that Sid, basically that Richard Hamlin was arrested, he was totally lost custody of his children because he was deemed to be an abusive and unfit father. And I will say there is a decent chance that he was somewhat abusive, but to be clear, what do you think would happen, if you found out that your wife had been molesting your children, how rationally could you truly react to that situation? Don't you think you might get angry and maybe even abusive for a time? There's a very good possibility that most people in that situation would react that way, and it's not to excuse his behavior, but it certainly doesn't make him a monster if you hear that your wife has been doing that to your children. The problem is that was the only part of the story that was presented by the state, that clearly Susan herself was a victim turned victimizer, and she was not a fit mother for her children either. And yet she ultimately, when all the dust settled, she was the one who got full custody of all the children, while Richard Hamlin was put away in prison. Without reading, I'm still trying to get my hands on the full transcripts to see exactly how the case went down. And it's quite possible there's some evidence that I haven't seen yet that may paint Richard Hamlin in an even worse light. I don't want to draw full conclusions without seeing all of the available evidence. And as soon as I get that, I'll be glad to update people if there's anything more. But what I can say from just seeing this is that clearly, at the very least, there are two sides to every story. And the part of the story that was presented by the state to make it seem like Hamlin had just beaten his wife into fabricating these claims of abuse is almost certainly not true. The claims of abuse are corroborated by outside sources, and the claims that she abused her own children are corroborated by outside sources. Ultimately, I think that it's quite likely that neither of them were fit parents ultimately after the full extent of what happened came to light. But for them to go with one of their parents, the one for whom there's evidence, independent evidence, that she had been molesting them, certainly something that no one has ever claimed or substantiated about Richard Hamlin, that's just egregious to me. And it seems that, I don't know if the state was, if the fix was in, or if the state was just trying to make this as simple a case as they could. But ultimately, I think that there was a miscarriage of justice here. I think that Richard Hamlin, at minimum, was telling the truth about his wife's claims of abuse, and maybe he did some horrible things too, but he certainly seems to have been made into the scapegoat to try and close the books on this case rather than explore the full extent of where it would lead to.
Yeah, you're right. And about against the Richard Hamlin statement, to circle back to that, it says, renowned and well-inspected investigative reporter Virginia McAuliffe from newsmakingnews.com has discovered the following. Individuals who wish to remain unidentified have said that Dr. Sid Siemer is a high-ranking member of the CIA-sanctioned child molestation ring called the Finders, and also a senior member of the Order of the Trapezoid, consisting of worshippers of the temple's Set. Um, I spent hours looking. I know you did too. Neither one of us can confirm any of that.
Yeah, we both tried pretty hard on this one. I mean, certainly, this case is definitely an important one, whether there's a finder's connection or not. I mean, the stuff that happens with these pedophile rings, it's not just the common cases like Franklin or Presidio or McMartin, the ones that we've all heard about. Obviously, those are real and those are important, but what I sort of posit as my belief is that this activity, this kind of systemic corruption, is not limited to a couple of these cases that
Yes, of
break
course.
into the headlines. It's really a bunch of a manner of how governments all over the country, local and state and national governments, conduct their operations. And there certainly are plenty of cases that are not as well publicized as Franklin, but are essentially identical to it. And if you turn over the rocks in pretty much any locality, any state, you're bound to find something like this going on. That's just the way that these structures of power operate and control everything. So, a case like what happened with Sid Siemer, and his daughter and his grandchildren as well, these kind of multi-generational abuse networks is, it's tragic and unfortunately seems to be going on a lot more than we would like to admit. But, really this is just what happens when such an ever-present phenomenon, you occasionally catch glimpses of it and see it in one case, and we have a responsibility to seize upon these cases when they do come out and try to push forward as much as we can and expose them to the greatest extent possible, because each one of these cases is essentially a window into a much larger phenomenon.
Yes. Is that all that you want to say about revisiting the curious case of Sid Siemer? Is it all you want to? Anything else you want to bring up, George? Anything else you can think of?
For now, no, I don't think so. I mean, that pretty much covers it. I can't say that there's a ton of new stuff, unfortunately. Just that when I was getting these documents, really what I wanted to find out was, is Richard Hamlin a liar, and should I just stop bothering to investigate any of this, or was he telling the truth, and is there something darker being covered up here? Certainly, if you were just reading the mainstream treatments of this case,
Yes.
you wouldn't get any of this evidence. It wasn't really mentioned in these mainstream press articles in the Mountain Democrat or these other news organizations covering the trial that there was apparently real evidence of Richard Hamlin's side of the story being true. It was very much slanted against him, and there are some documents in the court filings that I saw which indicated that yes, even the judge appeared to be very biased against against Hamlin from the very beginning, that believing that he was guilty, and that was a basis for an appeal of Hamlin's, which was denied. But yeah, ultimately I think that this is a good indicator that the story of what happened with Richard Hamlin and Susan Hamlin and his children and his father-in-law Sid Siemer has not yet been revealed. There's a lot more to do, and just trying to bury it under the rug as the state has done so far is unconscionable. There's a lot more to look at here.
Yeah, you're right. And hopefully we'll be able to uncover more and try to figure out exactly what happened. Um, I guess just to circle back to start with um, JonBenet Ramsey case. Do you want to give us a brief overview? I remember, this one when the case had gone on and seeing it in the news, and it being publicized. It was everywhere. When I was growing up, I was 11. Happened on Christmas, 1996.
Yeah.
So around that time period, I mean, I was old enough to actually remember, the case and it being publicized everywhere and being in the news and and so it's interesting, even from an early age, being starting my teenage years. I thought that it was her parents, John and Patsy. I found them to be suspicious. Even back then, when I was a kid, something just didn't seem to add up correctly with it. I remember my dad, who was a conspiracy theorist, he would talk about it and say that he believed that that they were involved too. So go ahead, let me know. Start with
Yeah,
the JonBenet Ramsey case, and we'll discuss some more further.
sure. I mean, what I was talking about with the Hamlin or Siemer family is actually kind of a startling parallel to this. It's what we saw with Sid Siemer and his daughter and grandchildren was essentially an intergenerational cycle of abuse, where the child abuse is basically handed down from parent to child, and then they become the parents and abuse their own children. And what with the JonBenet Ramsey case, there are unfortunately disturbing indications that a very similar thing happened with the Ramsey fam, if not the Ramsey family, the people around it. And I think there's a decent chance that the Ramsey family was involved in the activity, but it also goes way beyond the Ramsey family. I think this case is far more complicated and expansive than pretty much anyone who studies this case in the mainstream truly recognizes it. For people who aren't aware of it, and honestly, I was one of those people at first. JonBenet Ramsey case is actually was a few years before my time, before I was even born, honestly. But I came across it several years ago, and it was a disturbing parallel to much of these pedophile network cases that we've seen elsewhere. JonBenet Ramsey, she was a 6-year-old girl living in Boulder, Colorado. She was the daughter of John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey, and both of her parents had some interesting connections and prominence. They were John Ramsey was a millionaire businessman. He was in the tech industry. He ran a company called Access Graphics. Access Graphics was a computer equipment reseller. It was a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. It's a major defense contractor, and John Ramsey was, in fact, sitting on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin at the time, among other people such as Dick Cheney's wife. So he was a millionaire businessman, and in fact, Access Graphics had raked in $1 billion revenue in 1996 when or the year before JonBenet was killed. And his wife, Patsy Ramsey, she had been a former beauty queen in West Virginia, where she grew up. She was Miss West Virginia in 1977 to compete in Miss America 1978. She had gone on to work in the advertising industry in Atlanta with her degree in that field, and she ended up meeting John Ramsey. They married, and so John started Access Graphics, a former company before it became Access Graphics, supposedly in their basement in Atlanta. It began, growing as a business, then eventually they merged with some other companies and moved it to Boulder. They had one child, Burke Ramsey, and then 3 years later they had JonBenet as a child. And JonBenet was, from a relatively young age, she was pushed into the same sort of beauty pageant lifestyle that Patsy Ramsey herself had taken part in. And ultimately, when JonBenet was found, dead, and all of this evidence of what she had been involved in beauty pageants came about, this was one of the things that really made the case stand out and become such a big national sensation. That this child, who was only 6 years old or less, had essentially been dressed up like like a woman, from almost in a very sexualized manner, essentially being made to strut around in a provocative manner. And essentially what was going on in the child pageant industry to a lot of people seemed like more or less socially acceptable child pornography playing out for an adoring audience. So for JonBenet to be involved in an activity like this, which ended up shocking and disgusting so many Americans, was certainly a part of why this case became a big sensation. But ultimately, yeah, JonBenet, what happened to her was tragic. I mean, she was, universally was, seen as such a, sweet girl, and also, not what happened to her with beauty pageants, being forced to, doll up and everything, was not her entire persona either. She was somewhat of a tomboy, and she was also very bright and articulate for her age. So she had a very promising future for her, and just it was all robbed of her at the age of just 6, when she was found brutally murdered in her family's basement. She had been beaten on the head, she had been strangled, and she had been sexually assaulted. It was a brutal crime, and really all of this coming together sort of shocked the conscience of millions of Americans that something like this could happen, that an innocent girl could just be found dead and no one would have any idea what happened to her. And I think that's the core of the case, why it seized people's attention so much. But when you really start to peel back the layers and try to find out what went on in the case, it really just, you start to realize, almost everyone in this case, there's something wrong with their behavior. Almost all the adults who surrounded the family, and indeed within the family, there's something wrong in the picture with all of them, and it's a much darker reality than the simple narratives that a lot of people try to reduce it to. Saying that either one of the people in the family did it, or that an intruder just broke in and did it on their own, and that was the end of the story. This case, from everything that I've studied and that many other people before me, like Stephen Singular, Boulder political activist Evan Ravitz, and Bob McFarland, another great researcher named Frank Zell, all these people who have studied this case, in a serious manner, not just going along with the mainstream narrative, have found that what happened to JonBenet was basically a glimpse into the darkest realities of these underground pedophile networks.
Yeah, very, very much so. And it's been sensationalized in the media and the news
So
very strongly.
basically, and I can go into, what, sort of just developing the scene and some of the things that initially seemed odd, and take it from there.
Yeah, George. Hold on. What I was gonna say is, it's been one thing is in the media and the news, it's been very sensationalized to the point where they've done everything to just completely circumvent that information coming out. That there was a larger network at play in the JonBenet Ramsey case. That was going on, that connects to a lot of these other networks that were going on at the time, and still continue to this day. One's known and one's not unknown. So it was like when I went to the Linz the Linz Museum, the National Enquirer Museum up in Pigeon Forge. And they had a JonBenet Ramsey, a section of the museum for the National Enquirer's case on it, and I sent you those pictures that I had found there that JonBenet had drew that looked very much like you see pictures that have been drawn by SRA victims. Looked very
Yeah.
similar to them, so it like blew my mind when I saw those photos. I was like, "Oh my God, George has to see this," because you're, one of the lead investigators, especially the lead modern investigator on the JonBenet Ramsey case. So I sent it to you, and I was like, "Man, have you ever seen these?" And they look exactly like SRA pictures. I mean, they were, it looked like pictures of JonBenet drawing herself being abused by adult victims.
Yeah, and I think that really is the hidden subtext of what went on in this case. And unfortunately, it seems that no matter what side of the fence people fell on, whether it was the side of believing the Ramseys were responsible or believing that someone outside the family was responsible, and I personally believe it's a hybrid of both of those, people were very invested for the most part in ignoring the possibility that this was a primarily, was motivated by some kind of pedophile ring or trafficking situation. And a lot of what and the problem with this case is that it is it's a complicated one. It's not something you can reduce to one of the simple scenarios, because there's evidence that's pointing in both directions, both to the family and to other people outside of it. And a lot of people try to just focus on what the evidence supporting what they believe, which scenario they believe, and minimize the rest. But really, you have to take all of it together. When you look at the circumstances in how JonBenet was found and what happened at the house, there are certain things, suggestive of some kind of inside job, or at the very least someone very close to the family who was involved, if not the family itself. I mean, basically, what the official timeline of what happened is that, the Patsy Ramsey, they woke, and she and John, they woke up early in the morning around 5 a.m., and, Patsy was going through the house, and she ended up discovering that JonBenet was missing from her room, and then as it went through the house further, found that there was a multi-page ransom note that had been left by the stairwell. And this ransom note, it went on for 2.5 pages, and it was pretty, melodramatic and kind of hard to believe for almost anyone. A criminal basically was like, Mr. Ramsey, we represent a small foreign faction, and basically, tried to portray itself as, a terrorist group that had kidnapped JonBenet for ransom. It told him to it basically told him to withdraw $118,000 as a ransom amount, which coincidentally or not just so happened to basically match the bonus that John Ramsey had received from his company Access Graphics that year. Basically told him to get his ransom, and said, you better, follow our instructions. Any deviation will result in the immediate execution of your daughter.
Yeah,
Said, we're
weren't there some
watching you. Don't
more
call the police.
George?
Basically,
Weren't there some more weird things about the note too as well? About very specific about the attaché and the
yeah,
language that was used in the note.
yeah,
Too.
right. I mean, a lot of the language too was really overwrought, like saying, make sure you bring an adequate sized attaché to the bank. Saying things like, "Don't try to grow a brain, John. You follow our instructions. We are very familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics." This was one of the most, dramatic, ransom notes, pretty much in
Sounds like someone's been
criminal.
watching too much Law and Order.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, to think that a genuine kidnapper, or criminal would write something like this, it kind of, strains belief. This is not something. I mean, if it's an intruder, why would you go in and waste your time writing a lengthy note like this and this note was written on a notepad in the home. It's not like they brought in their own note that they had pre-made. So whoever was doing this had, clearly was taking their time inside the Ramsey's home making this note. There's no reason to make something this long and melodramatic anyway if you're kidnapping a child, or as it would later be revealed, she was never kidnapped. She was, in fact, murdered, and she was dead in the basement at the time. But ultimately, at the time, at the very least, and by the way, I see someone mentioned in the chat Lindbergh 2.0. Yes, this is quite reminiscent of what happened to Charles Lindbergh's child, the eaglet, and the Lindbergh kidnapping. I think there's a very good chance that that was a staged hoax, that it was an inside job, and that Charles Lindbergh was responsible for that. And people can read "Program to Kill" by Dave McGowan and go to the final chapter for that. But that's a whole other story. Ultimately, at the time that they had seen this, that Patsy discovered this, she took it, she and John, or at least appeared to take it seriously and think it really was a kidnapping. So they called the police. They called 911. Police did come over pretty shortly thereafter, or an officer came over, sort of surveyed the scene, but didn't really do any major search of the house. It seems the officers also pretty much just assumed that it really was a kidnapping, that JonBenet was missing. So, while this was going on, right after Patsy hung up the phone for 911, she also invited over many of the Ramseys' friends, like, they called the White family. That would be Fleet White and Priscilla White. And Fleet White at the time was John Ramsey's best friend. Fleet White was an oil company executive. He worked for a company called Fleet Oil Company with his father, also named Fleet White Sr., that had been run out of California. John Ramsey and Fleet White had been friends for quite a while, sort of bonded over various things like a love for sailing, and perhaps bonded over more than that, as we'll see. Called over Fleet and Priscilla White to the house where they're best friends and lived not that far away from the home. They called over John Fernie and Barbara Fernie. John was a developer. Barbara was his wife, and she was the daughter of an investment banker out of New York named Claude Vandenbroek. They also called over, oddly enough, their pastor from St. John's Episcopal Church, Father Roel Hufferstock, and also called over JonBenet's pediatrician, Dr. Francisco Buff. So all of these people, all these pretty close friends of the family, were in the house at the same time that the police had been called in, and really outnumbered the police presence too. It took about 2 hours before any detective ever came onto the scene, and so that was Detective Linda Arndt, who did child sex crimes. And so, she began appraising the situation, seeing what was up, and trying to work with the family to arrange the ransom payment. And essentially, nothing substantive was really achieved for a while. some of them were arranging the ransom, some of them were just milling about, not really doing anything. And ultimately, after several hours passed, it would have been around 1 p.m. With tension still rising in the house, Detective Arndt told John and Fleet to do a thorough search of the house and see if they missed anything. And upon doing so, John and Fleet just went down to the basement, and they went into this remote, out of the way cellar in the basement, and John found JonBenet's body, and screamed, "Oh my God!" Brought her upstairs. Linda Arndt pronounced her dead. They said a prayer, and that was it. JonBenet was found dead. She had never been removed from the house at all. The ransom note was a clear farce from the very beginning, and so, immediately this turned from a missing child to a homicide investigation. And of course, law enforcement, would be scrambling to figure out what happened. And as soon as it hit the press, the whole of America was really scrambling to figure out what happened. And, the ransom note, the circumstances of JonBenet, being found in her own house with the ransom note as well. This is a scenario that's never been replicated in the true crime world before or after, which is very odd. The fact that JonBenet was found in a very out-of-the-way part of the house, and by the way, the Ramseys themselves went on CNN and outright said, a casual guest would not know where this, where the cellar was. Only someone who was very familiar with their family's patterns, would know to go to this place and put JonBenet there if it had been an intruder. So already we're looking at pretty much had to be family or somebody very close to the family, and those sorts of things started to add up and make it look very, very suspicious for the Ramseys. And there were a couple other things as well that were noted. For example, the 9/11 dispatcher, whose name was Kim Archuleta, she had heard that basically, she was taking Patsy's call, and Patsy essentially, she was hysterical. She was like, said they, taken my baby, but then, she didn't stay on the line and, await for any, further instructions or give any further information to Kim Archuleta. She pretty much left the phone immediately, and then the phone ended up hanging up shortly thereafter. But before it had completely hung up, Kim Archuleta, per her testimony, her claims heard, Patsy's demeanor completely changed, and that she was holding a conversation with some other people, off the line. She didn't sound super distressed anymore. She sounded like she had completely gone, personality switch, and was talking to these other people. And for some reason, Kim Archuleta was put under a gag order and not allowed to testify to the grand jury. So it seems that there was a vested interest in burying this indicator of how they were reacting that morning as well. And then another one of those weird things as well is that, the ransom note said expect a call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. And according to, according to the detective on the scene, Linda Arndt, the deadline came and went. It was 10 a.m. passed, and literally no one in the house, not the Ramseys, not the Whites, not the Fernies, nobody, aside from Linda Arndt herself, even realized that the deadline had passed, which was pretty odd. And I know that some people try to take this and claim, well, the ransom note was ambiguous. They probably actually meant the following day, not the same day they found John, not the same day that they found the note to begin with. But if you actually watch, John Ramsey in his interview on an A&E documentary, he openly says, my heart leapt every time he got a call that morning. So he clearly was expecting or he would claim later that he was expecting the call to come that morning. So for him to claim that, that he was expecting a call that morning, but then for him to not have any apparent reaction or concern when the deadline comes and goes, and there's no, and there's absolutely no call from the supposed kidnappers at all, does raise a lot of questions about the extent to which they really were concerned and whether they might have really known that JonBenet was already dead. And not just about the Ramseys, I should note. It raises questions about everyone else in the house who were friends of the Ramseys, whether they truly, believed that this was a kidnapping or knew that she had already been dead. And, so all these things sort of came together, and they really stuck in the minds of the early detectives like Linda Arndt, who started to, wonder about, really started to wonder about the family and people like John Ramsey in particular. And, for the Boulder police certainly had their suspicions in that direction And as the investigation wound on, there were several concerning things that came out about the Ramseys, and for example, there were contradictions in the Ramseys' own statements about what happened that previous night. When John Ramsey made his initial statements to detectives Rick French and Linda Arndt in December, right on the day that JonBenet was found, and then also in early January for some subsequent statements that were recorded by these detectives. He basically said, we came home that night. I read a story to JonBenet, and then put her to bed afterwards. And then I played with Burke for a while, and then went to bed. And this is in multiple police reports by multiple detectives. There's really no getting around that. And then a couple months later, when John Ramsey does his first official interview with police, he tells a completely different story, saying, "Oh, JonBenet was already asleep when we went home from our Christmas party that previous night, and I carried her up to bed, and she never woke up. I put her in bed, and I never saw her again that night." So his story completely changes about when he last saw JonBenet and what happened that night. That was one, certainly very concerning aspect of his testimony. Another very odd thing that came up with the Ramseys as well is that there's not even a consensus on who was responsible for the 911 call, which is pretty, anomalous. And a lot of the statements that John Ramsey made to, the press, and in general, you would see that John Ramsey sort of seemed to be taking the lead ultimately in how he and Patsy handled the media and the case, that he was trying to essentially press forward and make it look, sort of create a united front, and he was in control of the response more or less. And John Ramsey would generally claim, "Oh yeah, I told Patsy to call 911, and she did." But then in the A&E documentary, when Patsy's talking, she actually told a completely different version of events, which was, "Oh, I decided to call 911 and I went downstairs to do it." So there's a lot of just various things in the statements that they've made, don't match with their prior statements, don't match with other things on record. And there's also the weird thing as well that as soon as JonBenet's body was discovered, and this is substantiated based on police reports as well, immediately upon JonBenet's body being discovered, John Ramsey was basically itching to fly out of Boulder as soon as possible and had organized a flight down to Atlanta. And he tried to claim, according to these reports, "Oh, I have an important meeting down in Atlanta that I can't miss." Well, that statement is clearly not true, because the family had been planning to go to their summer home in Charlevoix on a vacation that day. So clearly the claim that, "Oh, I have a meeting that I can't miss," does not add up. And he clearly was trying to come up with some excuse to get out of the glare of detectives and scrutiny as soon as possible, it would appear. So already you have a lot of these strange, very curious behaviors that the Ramseys are exhibiting in their statements and their actions, and it certainly raises a lot of red flags. And the whole scenario that I've gone over, the fact that she's found in her own home with this rambling ransom note written on a notepad in the family's, that was owned by the family itself, and also the fact that there were no real signs of forced entry that could be found by the detectives. John Ramsey himself had reported that all the doors were locked on the first floor, and all these potential entrances for an intruder were locked. It seemed very unlikely that an intruder would have gone in that way. And a basement window well also, there was one of these hypothesized points of entry. There was a big layer of dirt and grime that was undisturbed, so that also seemed quite unlikely. And so ultimately, there's a lot of stuff about the family's initial reaction that put them in the glare of suspicion. And that is indeed what the media seized on. And for a while, the tabloids basically made it sort of a cottage industry of the Ramseys killed their child, and they had a new theory every week. It would seem it might have been that John Ramsey had been molesting JonBenet. Might have been that that Patsy had killed JonBenet because she got mad at her for something. Some of them were even going to say that Burke did it. The tabloids were just churning out story after story, all this, hyperbolic stuff based on the initial facts of the case, which indeed seemed pretty irregular and did put the family under what I would consider reasonable suspicion. But, ultimately, the case goes way beyond that of simple domestic dispute gone wrong, and there are so many things pointing to that. And, the very first thing that I would bring up is that JonBenet Ramsey had been sexually abused, and not just sexually abused on the night of her attack, but in fact sexually abused at a long term, chronically. And this conclusion was, first observed by Dr. John Meyer, the coroner in Boulder, who did the autopsy, who told Linda Arndt privately, there's no doubt that, someone had sexual contact with JonBenet Ramsey. He never said this publicly, but he did swear it out to Detective Arndt. Several months later, the Boulder police assembled a panel of forensic, basically of forensic experts, medical experts from all over the country, such including Dr. Richard Krugman in the University of Chicago and all these other experts who jointly came to the unanimous conclusion that JonBenet Ramsey had not just been sexually abused on the night of her death, but had been sexually abused at a point before her death as well. There was clear evidence of trauma to her vagina indicating that, of prior, most likely long-term abuse. And also coming to this conclusion was Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was Dr. Cyril Wecht, a lot of people probably heard of him. He was a pretty, sort of famous forensic, forensic doctor. He was a medical examiner in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. He was well known for criticism of the Kennedy assassination autopsy and single bullet theory, which he didn't believe. He was on one panel for the government reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination. He was the lone person to say that JFK had, to say that the single bullet theory was nonsense. And Cyril Wecht came to the same conclusion that JonBenet had indications of prior sexual abuse, that she had been abused for a very long time. And so all of these doctors came to the same consensus about JonBenet being, having prior sexual abuse. And once again, more so than all this other stuff that I brought up before, which of course, is behavioral evidence, is stuff that seems weird about the family, but certainly does not prove offhand that the family was involved. It's just a lot of things that add up and paint a weird picture. But if JonBenet Ramsey was chronically sexually abused, as all the medical experts you pretty much unanimously agreed at the very beginning, then there's no getting around the fact that someone in her family or someone close enough to her that they could do it without her family being aware had been molesting her. And ultimately, it is pretty difficult to believe that she could have been molested long term without her family being aware and or complicit in that. So, ultimately, when you have all this evidence together, it seems to appear JonBenet was abused for a long time, or at least definitely abused before the night of her death. That the whole scenario of how she was found points to an inside job or someone very close to the family. And so, you already have, the Ramseys looking suspicious. But there's actually a lot more evidence going beyond the Ramseys as well, and something that a lot of the people who pick up on this evidence implicating the Ramseys miss, and that is, the foreign DNA evidence found at the crime scene. And what was ultimately discovered was that JonBenet there was DNA that was found inside of her underwear, intermingled with her own blood. This was foreign DNA from an unidentified male. And for a while, it was unknown if this DNA was, if it was, just some incidental touch DNA, transferred through some innocent way from a factory worker or contamination in the lab, or whether it came from some more, from someone who was actually involved in the crime, of murdering her. But ultimately, it was discovered several years later that the same DNA sample that was intermingled in her underwear was on the outside of her long johns as well. So you have a foreign DNA sample from an unidentified male, which is found inside her underwear and outside of her, her garments that she was wearing, which is pretty hard to claim it's all factory contamination on, two separate pieces of her clothing, one on the outside and one on the inside. So, although many, people who accept a lot of this evidence pointing to the Ramseys miss, they accept all that, but then they try to claim that the DNA doesn't mean anything because they think, well, the Ramseys did it, therefore any evidence pointing to someone else must somehow be invalid. So, but the evidence, from everything I've seen, the DNA evidence, it holds up, it's genuine, and there clearly was some unidentified male who was involved in the commission of this crime. No good explanation of how it would end up inside of her underwear otherwise. So what you start to see, is a very disturbing picture, and it's a mix of many of the scenarios that people, who study the Ramsey case have followed. There's sort of a dichotomy. People either think Ramsey's did it, they say RDI, or Intruder did it, IDI. They come up with these cute little acronyms to try and talk about this stuff. But ultimately, there's a fusion of these different elements together, where you see that you know, the there's evidence pointing to it being a staged crime scene and some kind of inside job with the complicity of the parents in setting it up. You see that JonBenet has been chronically sexually abused, and it's almost impossible that that would happen without someone in the family being complicit. But then you have DNA evidence showing that somebody who was outside of the family was also involved in the crime. So, ultimately what you see is that this is not as simple as the parents did it or someone else did it. It's the parents were complicit and somebody else outside the family was also responsible for it. And indeed, the grand jury, there was a grand jury indictment that was later unsealed of the both Ramsey parents, which essentially said exactly this. The indictment said, that it was the same charges for both Ramsey parents, and it said, the Ramseys did, unreasonably permit their child to be placed in a situation that endangered her, and resulted in her death. That was one of the charges by the grand jury. The other charge as well was that they, did, render assistance to someone knowing that they were suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. So the grand jury, which had been set up to investigate this case, literally came to the conclusion that yes, the Ramseys had some level of involvement in covering up the crime, but they did not actually kill their daughter. They placed her in a situation that led to her death, and then they covered for whoever was responsible for it. And if you read Stephen Singular's book, which called Presumed Guilty, which is an excellent book on this case, probably the best one out there that there is, Stephen Singular talked to the reporter who initially broke this story, and the reporter pretty much gave his opinion based on his own legal work to try and get the grand jury documents unsealed, and also talking to some of the grand jurors themselves. Basically said that the grand jury indictment was almost certainly referring to some unidentified adult third party who was involved along with the Ramseys. So the grand jury had come up with this evidence, basically put together the full picture of the crime back in 1999 when the grand jury finished. However, the fact that the grand jury had even rendered an indictment was totally buried. The prosecutor in Boulder County basically said there was no indictment handed down, or pretty much led the public to believe there was no indictment. And so for a while, everyone believed the grand jury had exonerated the Ramseys, not been able to indict them for anything, when in fact the grand jury had more or less worked out the scenario of the Ramseys being complicit with some other third parties and allowing their child to be abused, and this had been hidden for 14 years. So ultimately, what we see here is that there's a much bigger picture of the case if you just examine the evidence at the crime scene and what happened to JonBenet, and also the grand jury and the investigation that happened. You see that the picture is basically that her parents were complicit in allowing her to be abused by some others, and that really is the view of the case that gives you the biggest ability to figure out what really transpired and investigate all these other connections to pedophiles in and around Boulder and put those pieces together to see what truly happened.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Cyril Wecht, I'm probably butchering his name, but I did some research for him because he also he's been with a lot of cases. Like I'll name some of them in a minute, but he actually chimed in on the Jeffrey McDonald case, and that he believes that Jeffrey McDonald's story that he's told, that happened at the night that his wife and Colette and children were murdered. That is what he said happened. Like he was agreeing with he thinks McDonald is innocent. That there were at least two or more people in the McDonald house at the time. And Cyril Wecht, of course, he's involved in talking about the RFK assassination. That it was not the gun that Sirhan had fired was the one that killed RFK, or interesting enough, I guess, being involved in the Sonny von Bulow case, where Alan Dershowitz was the defense attorney for that case, and apparently he did something for Vince Foster too as well. I'd be very curious to see what Wecht said about the Vince Foster murder. Of course, you and I both know that the Clintons were involved, but it's just very interesting of how he was involved in all of these very high-profile cases. But from what I've seen, seems to take the conspiratorial stance in almost every one. I find that a little bit
Yeah.
eye-raising, if you know what I mean.
Well,
Uh,
I do. The thing is, I mean, Cyril Wecht at one point, I think he was even prosecuted by the Bush
yeah, I was about to
administration.
say that. That was my next thing. And guess who? Guess who his defense attorney was?
Oh,
Dick Thornburg.
oh wow. Actually, no, I do remember that now that you mention it. Yeah, it certainly was eye-raising, and I mean, I would think that he and Dick Thornburg wouldn't normally find much to agree on, but who knows? I mean, Cyril Wecht, the guy, it does interest me whenever you see a person involved in all these high profile cases. You sort of wonder if, why this person would even be able to comment on every single one of them. But in general, I found Cyril Wecht to be pretty credible and truthful.
Yeah.
He has more or less put his kind of staked his reputation on a lot of these viewpoints that are not at all mainstream, like you say. He's willing to defend basically willing to go against the scientific consensus on the magic bullet theory, which absurdly, it seems that most scientists would rather just save their career by saying that, oh yeah, the magic bullet theory makes perfect sense in the Kennedy assassination, rather than actually look at the evidence and realize that it's a total load of nonsense. And similarly with JonBenet, he really just confirmed the same conclusion that all the other respected pathologists came to as well,
Yeah.
that JonBenet had been chronically abused. And ultimately, all this stuff comes together and forms a picture that JonBenet is kind of what happened to her, that basically a glimpse into this world that we see with Franklin and all of the other cases as well. That she comes from a family that allowed this to happen. She was abused like these kids are from a young age. And this is just a situation when it went too far, and she ended up being killed as a result, instead of just silently suffering and trying to lead on a normal life while it was all going on. But ultimately, and I can talk about this
No,
next,
I'm
is
actually
that,
reading the Vince Foster thing real quick about what he said about it, and it was the Clinton administration that used Cyril Wecht as their investigator, as a forensic pathologist into the my belief assassination of murder of Vincent Foster. Cyril Wecht actually did not, from what I see. He actually backed up that it was a suicide.
hmm, really? Wow. Yeah, I mean, that is very odd. I hadn't seen that about him before, and I guess I would have to.
I guess someone needs to
Certainly
take the time to see each case that he looked at, whether or not he casted shade on it or not, or because
Yeah,
I mean Jeffrey McDonald. I hopefully that's one of my cases if I'm ever able to get to, because it's right down the street. Not down the street, but I mean it's like 20 miles away from me. But Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where it happened. I mean I've been on the street uh, the murders occurred. Castle Street, I think it's the street. It's been a long time, but I've been there. But yeah, I mean it's very interesting that he would actually, for Foster, say it's a suicide. Okay, I didn't mean. I just wanted to
yeah.
bring that up.
Well, no, I mean it's good to bring it up, and I think that Cyril Wecht, I don't think necessarily captured the full picture of what happened to JonBenet Ramsey. I think that in his book that he wrote on the case, Cyril Wecht basically said that he thought this was a sex game gone wrong involving John Ramsey, and really just John Ramsey, no one else. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that the chronic sexual abuse of JonBenet did not necessarily even include John Ramsey. It may well have. I would not be too surprised if he was one of her abusers. But to think that he was the only abuser is you can't really conclude that just based on the medical evidence. Certainly, there are many more scenarios beyond the simplistic ones that even Cyril Wecht wanted to consider. And I actually have a video of him, which I want to upload sometime later, of him on, I think, the Geraldo show, and basically having it out with one of the defense lawyers who was defending the Ramseys, and it gets really heated and doesn't really reflect well on either of them when you get done with it. He sort of just has it really just seems that he was, to an extent, playing into a lot of the sensationalism of this case, and trying to, blow it up into a big media storm. I think that Cyril Wecht and all these other pathologists are right about the sexual abuse and the individual evidence. I think they're wrong about the ultimate conclusions they draw, and I think that's the systemic problem with the way that the Ramsey case is covered. That all these people, whatever side of the fence they fall on, can be right about one piece of evidence, but then they get so attached to thinking that it must be one of those basic scenarios and that all the other evidence has to be thrown out to comport with it. And that doesn't really, ultimately, when you study cases like these, what my friend Thomas Myrtle and we call deep crimes, which are true crime cases that have hidden depth and hidden elements to them. And when you study cases like these, it's often that, there are two, there's the official narrative, there's the conspiracy narrative, there are at least two narratives out about the case, and you're often inclined to want to pick a side, but sometimes you have to accept that maybe somewhere between the two narratives is where the truth actually lies, and that's what Stephen Singular maintains as well. But ultimately, when you look into the Ramsey case, you see that there is, not just the familiar elements of child abuse and, parental complicity. There's also the familiar elements of law enforcement complicity, which we can get into as well, of
Yeah,
helping to cover up what happened.
yeah. Let's go ahead and get into that, and then let's look into the broader picture of was this part of a larger pedophile network? Was there any child pornography involved? As Ed
Yeah.
Opperman, who private investigator who's going to be on the show, and Ed's done a lot of great research to it well, and is a very excellent interviewer. Mentioned in his interview too. I guess want to bring up with you is a lot of these beauty pageants for children. It's just a breeding ground for pedophiles, to live out their sickest fantasies. Is it not a lot of the child modeling and everything like that occurs, and the beauty pageants and everything? I mean, Ed brought it up in his interview with you, and it
Yeah.
seems to be very true. At least some of that was at least explored by the general narrative that the media had put out. Strangely enough, on the JonBenet Ramsey case, they would talk about quite frequently in the movies and in media reports about those pageants being kind of sketchy. Interestingly enough, they didn't shy away from that aspect, but they would not discuss the possible larger nexus of this being part of the multiple CIA, United States government, other governments to pedophile networks that we've talked about a lot together, and I've talked about on this channel, and you've put evidence forth of cavdev.org, and kind of shied away from that. So yeah, but first let's start with uh, that the police department covering it up first.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I did just want to say, I mean, what you mentioned about the pageants is absolutely correct, and like what I said, just was more or less socially acceptable child pornography. That it's something that is essentially you're just putting on a show for people who are pedophiles. I mean, why else would you enjoy watching these underage girls who are not even in the sometimes not even in the double digits of age yet, dress up like they're adult women, parade around the stage, act flirtatiously, and dance provocatively, have their, chests bunched up so that it looks like they are showing cleavage. This is absolutely sickening, and this is what the industry is like. And yes, as you say, it's sort of a breeding ground, way to groom these children into, sexually servicing adults in other ways as well. And we will definitely get into that, especially when talking about one guy, Randy Simons, who was arrested recently. But yeah, one of the biggest.
I guess real quick, George. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I guess something I want to talk about and get your opinion on, and we've discussed in private is I guess would circle about it'd be relative to this too as well. What about the information that came out on the Rhea Farmer interview with Wendy Webb about uh, Ivana Trump driving around with Ghislaine Maxwell and scoping out young girls, teenage girls, and bringing them into the limo for Les Wexner to be models for his various clothing companies like the Limited Two. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I believe it. I certainly don't, see anything that would make me think that it wasn't, and to make me think that this wasn't accurate. And I mean, in general, that was what we already knew from stories that were published as far back as last year, that was how Epstein got many of his victims,
yeah,
using Victoria's Secret modeling jobs as an entry to get these underage girls you know, into the clutches of this network and try to get them to start, sexually servicing Epstein and his friends. And especially when the Katie Johnson story is the same way that
Katie Johnson and Maria. It seems like that's what they were doing. Right?
well, right. Katie Johnson, her claim was that she was being offered a modeling job by Tiffany Doe, and of course that turned out to be Jeffrey Epstein. It's also the case that with Doreen Vincent in Connecticut, as we've discussed before, there's another potential connection given that she was kidnapped, or, well, she disappeared from Connecticut just 5 years before Maria did, that she's another possible connection to this network, given that her father reportedly took her out of Connecticut to so-called underwear modeling shoots in New York when she would have been just 12 years old at the time. And of course, her father also had pictures of her in her underwear. He was reportedly a practicing Satanist when he was in prison. So, there's a lot of this is the same way that these children are often brought into this network. And so, what Maria Farmer says may not be corroborated at this point, but everything she says seems eminently plausible to me and very likely.
Yeah, you're right. Or what about the Franklin scandal of Russell T. Nelson taking pictures of those who were involved and end up selling? They were kind of framing it as a guise of modeling too as well. I mean, they were doing even
Yeah,
back during the Franklin scandal.
right. And when we get into Randy Simons as well, it's pretty much exactly what he was doing as well to children in these pageants. So yes, it's a common practice. These rings are not very original. They really just do the same things over and over again, and they manage to achieve it through eventually brute. Just the fact that they have so much embedded influence is how they keep getting away with this. It's not that they're particularly clever or anything like that. They just keep doing these tactics and they keep working.
Yes. Okay. So how did it seem like the police covered up or botched the investigation into
Yeah,
the
well,
murder of John
right.
Bennett Ramsey?
Yeah, well, a multitude of ways, and it's not just one agency, in fact, that's responsible. It really seems to be multiple agencies. The Boulder Police Department, the Boulder County District Attorney's Office, and the FBI all appear to have some level of suspicious role and complicity in what happened. And a lot of it, in fact, traces all the way back to the very initial police response. Like I said, Detective Linda Arndt, she was pretty much in charge of this entire crime scene on her own for numerous hours of the day. She she was left in charge of managing the Ramseys, the Whites, the Fernies, Hoverstock, Dr. Buff, all of these people at once. And, basically, one officer can't control all these people when they're milling about the house, going, going all over the place and potentially contaminating vital evidence if indeed something transpired at this house. Because, of course, JonBenet's found dead in the house, so now the whole house should be a crime scene. But you just had all these people trample through it and potentially make a mess of everything rather than keeping them all in line, keeping them all in line and keeping them all orderly. And the problem is that, one detective can't do this on their own. And according to Linda Arndt, substantiated as well by her supervisor Larry Mason, she called for backup repeatedly that morning.
So
Yeah,
that we had to do.
oh yeah, yeah. So Linda Arndt called for backup from her supervisor repeatedly that morning, and she wanted to get more officers to help her secure the scene. She certainly was not derelict in what she was doing, but constantly the response was, "Everyone's in a meeting. We can't help you." So Linda Arndt was pretty much hung out to dry by her department, who did not allow her to have the resources to secure the scene. And what And so when everything went down, Linda Arndt was pretty much blamed for allowing the crime scene to be contaminated, even though she was put in an unenviable position where she couldn't have done it on her own. But she essentially became the scapegoat for that. Also, what happened, on the very same day after the Ramseys were, after it was discovered that JonBenet was killed, the Ramseys were brought in for, some additional questioning. It wasn't a formal interview at that point. They were brought in together as a couple, and they were asked questions. And anyone familiar with basic police procedure will tell you that this is not a legitimate way to investigate. You have two people who are potentially suspects because, of course, she was found dead in the home. Of course, the parents are suspects at the very least. And basic police procedure would tell you you need to separate these people, interview them separately, and see if any contradictions emerge between the two stories that they tell. But and in fact, the Boulder, low level officers, just regular detectives at the police department are not, weren't dumb. They knew this. They knew that this was what you're supposed to do. But the high level command staff of the Boulder Police Department told them not to do it this way. Commander John Eller, who was in charge of the investigation, essentially gave out the order to treat the Ramseys like their victims, not like their suspects. So that high level, because they're an influential family, in his own words. So because the Ramseys were an influential family, the high level staff of the police department essentially bent over backwards to make sure that the Ramseys were treated with kid gloves, not separated and interrogated. And one FBI agent who had consulted on the case pretty much said, the attitude and the high level command staff of the Boulder Police Department prevented the detectives from doing the job they knew they had to do. So already you see the high level command staff of the department prevents Linda Arndt from getting back up at the crime scene, so then the crime scene becomes contaminated and she becomes a scapegoat. Also prevents the detectives from doing their job and getting the Ramseys separated for questioning. So you can see that the individual detectives know what they're doing, yet the high-level command staff is pretty much hamstringing them. And it is interesting to note that, one of the detectives, Steve Thomas, later did write a book about the case, and I'll get into why I don't entirely trust Steve Thomas on a lot of things, but Steve Thomas wrote, interestingly enough, that a lot of the individual detectives on the Ramsey case received threats and harassment. Linda Arndt had blood splashed on her door. Detective Steve Thomas had a dead cat left on his doorstep. And Detective Bob Whitson, who had been involved in securing the crime scene afterwards, had 4 rounds fired through his house that nearly hit him. So many of these detectives were in fact facing not just intimidation from high-level command staff, they were facing literal threats to their well-being and their lives, which again is a very, familiar pattern with these cases. But what ultimately seems to have been the pervasive idea within the Boulder Police Department is that the Boulder Police did settle on believing that one of the Ramseys was involved, but they pretty quickly abandoned the possibility that John Ramsey had any sort of involvement or complicity, and making it all seem like it was Patsy Ramsey who was responsible. In other words, they tried to make Patsy the Patsy. So, and this wasn't, what they initially believed. Initially, the belief by most of the detectives was that this was some kind of incest scenario. They certainly believed that their suspicion was John Ramsey abused her. She ended up being killed. It was covered up. And they had even consulted with Marilyn Van Derber Atler, who was a former Miss Colorado and Miss America contestant who had been abused from a very young age by her father, who was a prominent businessman in the community. So that her story had a lot of parallels to JonBenet, and the police literally consulted with her on the case. They initially did seem to believe that was the right road to go down, but then pretty quickly after that, John Ramsey was exonerated as having written the ransom note. In the meantime, Patsy Ramsey was found. She wasn't found to have written the note, but she was found to have, not been able to be eliminated as the writer of the note. And so at that point, pretty much the suspicion within the department almost entirely shifted from John Ramsey, who, and keep in mind, John Ramsey is the businessman at Lockheed Martin, this major defense contractor who has a U.S. Navy background, and of course runs this big company that's taking in billion-dollar revenue, even though I would argue that's pretty implausible given the line of work that they were involved in. John Ramsey is the one in the Ramsey family who seems to have been the most suspicious out of all of them, and yet he is pretty much totally getting cleared by the police department. They instead are beginning to focus their suspicion on Patsy Ramsey. And Linda Arndt was pretty much the only holdout within the department who seemed to think that John was suspicious. Everyone else, the police chief Tom Covey, Commander John Eller, Sergeant Tom Wickman, who was in charge of the investigation, and of course Steve Thomas, the main lead detective on the case, all of them were closing ranks around the idea that Patsy Ramsey was the one who was involved with, who was totally involved in the case, and that John Ramsey was not. And what happened to Linda Arndt, who seemed to have the lone dissenting view, was that she was getting discredited in the press, through the tabloid press especially, and ultimately was taken off the case and forced out. Steve Thomas ended up leaking, basically making damaging claims to Vanity Fair and other sources, saying that Linda Arndt was an unprofessional detective. She was too close to Patsy Ramsey, that she essentially, that she couldn't be trusted. And then ultimately, in Steve Thomas's book, he wrote that Linda Arndt, when it seemed that she was about to be taken off the case, he claimed that Linda Arndt had threatened to shoot up the police department and then kill herself, which is a pretty outlandish claim that Steve Thomas put in his book. So Linda Arndt was pretty much under fire, being discredited by the rest of the department, all because she held the lone view that John Ramsey was a suspicious one, instead of Patsy Ramsey being the prime suspect. And Linda Arndt indeed went on TV and said that from the very beginning she had an uneasy feeling about John, and that when John brought JonBenet upstairs and they made eye contact, and she just got a feeling from John based on her multiple years as a professional sex crimes investigator that something was up with John, that he was complicit in this crime, that he was the guilty one. And for expressing this position, it would appear Linda Arndt was totally discredited by and forced out by the police department. And I know that it is controversial to suggest that Patsy Ramsey, the ransom note writer, is not what happened. Most people do tend to believe that Patsy Ramsey was the writer of the ransom note, and I did believe it at first. But what I want to point out is that the case for the handwriting match certainly was not as powerful as a lot of people seem to think. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation did write in a report. It was examiner Chet Ubowski. He said that it appears that it was Patsy Ramsey who wrote it, but the evidence falls short of that definitive conclusion. That was what was in the report. Steve Thomas represented Chet Ubowski's report as being very, he basically tried to claim that Chet Ubowski had even said that 24 of the 26 letters in Patsy's handwriting matched the ransom note. But Chet Ubowski later went to the local press and said that none of this was true, that that they don't do handwriting matches based on the number of letters that are similar, that Steve Thomas pretty much made it up, or he was told false information by somebody else at the department. So a lot of these claims about the strength of Patsy Ramsey being the writer are not as well founded as as a lot of people seem to think. And there were definitely some handwriting analysts like Dr. Sheila Lowe, Dr. Fausto Bringelli, and I have these people linked on CapDef, who believe that John Ramsey was in fact the writer. And there's also a great blogger out there named Doc G, who has a blog, solvingjohnbenet.blogspot.com, and he wrote many analyses on this, and he is indeed of the opinion that a lot of the language in the ransom note is a better match for John Ramsey than it is for Patsy, saying, for example, loving the use of percentages like were used in the ransom note, and other various things that are more indicative of John's language than Patsy's language. So ultimately, what seems to be the case is that the police department was bending over backwards to try and cover for John and make it seem like Patsy was a prime suspect, which is definitely troubling on its own. On the flip side of that, you have the Boulder County District Attorney's Office, which is behaving very, very inappropriately in terms of how they're dealing with the Ramseys and dealing with this case. So pretty much immediately after the JonBenet was found dead, the Ramsey parents lawyered up. They hired defense attorneys from the law firm of Hal Hadden. And Hal Hadden is Hal Hadden's a very interesting character, very well connected with the Colorado power structure. He, there was this one of these Denver Post columnists that even said, look at the law offices of Hal Hadden, look at the governor's mansion, tell me which one's bigger, I'll tell you which one's more powerful. That pretty much gives you a good indication of how powerful and well connected Hal Hadden was. He was a campaign manager of Gary Hart. He was a political contributor and ally of Alex Hunter, of multiple Democratic governors in the state of Colorado. He was well connected with the prosecutors in Alex Hunter's office. Alex Hunter was the district attorney of Boulder County who was handling the Ramsey case. So the Ramseys hired a defense attorney who was super friendly with the people who were supposedly going to be investigating them and maybe prosecuting them. And what ended up happening as a result of this was outrageous and something you would not see in any normal criminal investigation. The Ramseys managed to negotiate access to almost all of the evidence that the police and the DA had from the case. They got access to the police reports, their prior statements, they got copies of the ransom note, they got access to the garrote wire that had been found, around JonBenet's neck, potentially used by the attacker, potentially staged, but either way, they got access to this evidence just through negotiating, with their lawyers. So the DA's office was handing over all this internal evidence to the Ramseys, totally compromising the integrity of the investigation, because if you're going to interrogate someone, you don't want them to have access to their prior statements. You want to be able to see if they can remain consistent without having their notes to constantly refer back to, so that if they were lying, you can catch them in a lie rather than having them be able to reread what they've said before and tailor their statements to match all of that. So the DA's office behaved very improperly, and the level of closeness with the law firm of Hal Hadden is very troubling. At one point, one of the people in the DA's office had literally said, I'm not stopping my breakfast with Brian Morgan being one of Hal Hadden's partners who was defending the Ramseys. I've known him for years. So the DA office prosecutors who were supposed to be investigating the Ramseys and the whole case were literally having lunch, having breakfast, being totally friendly with the defense attorneys of the Ramseys. And they were essentially sucking up all this evidence out of the DA's files and giving them right over to the Ramseys defense team. So, that whole situation there is troubling, and there are indications that the DA's office behaved even more improperly than usual. There was basically a secure war room where the detectives were storing all their evidence, and in June, somebody broke into the war room, literally hacked their computers, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation claimed, it was just an electrical failure, but the detectives never really believed that explanation. And one of the weird things as well is that one of the DA's office prosecutors, Mary Keenan, had tried to access the war room using her key card just right around the time the hack took place. So it appears that the DA's office was literally trying to break into the police office, into the police's own file of evidence, and steal their own evidence. This came shortly after the police stopped trusting the DA's office and stopped sharing evidence because of how much of it had been shared with the Ramseys. So the DA's office may have been, beyond just improperly close to the defense team of the Ramseys, had actually been behaving, had actually been breaking laws to try and keep assisting the Ramseys. So, and I just want to make one note about Hal Hadden, who was the defense attorney of the Ramseys. There are many different... Hal Hadden had been involved in many high-profile cases and pretty suspect cases. He had been involved in defending Rockwell International Corporation for the Rocky Flats nuclear power plant on toxic waste dumping charges. He had, the grand jurors who oversaw the Rocky Flats case wanted to indict the Rockwell and some of their executives for environmental degradation and mishandling the plant. But Hal Hadden's lawyers managed to negotiate with the Justice Department under Bush Sr. a much lighter deal where no one went to jail, no one was prosecuted, just paid a slap on the wrist fine, and then the grand jury information was sealed for a long time as if the grand jurors had never wanted to indict them in the first place. He had also represented Kobe Bryant, who deceased of late January this year, on his sexual assault charges. he had represented Hunter Thompson, the infamous Gonzo writer, also on sexual assault charges. And
And
I should
didn't
note for
Hunter S. Thompson have connections supposedly to filming snuff films at the Bohemian Grove?
well, precisely, that was what I was about to say, that Hunter Thompson was
Sorry.
accused by a Franklin victim, by Paul Benassi, of being involved in snuff films. And actually, Hunter Thompson's, his after Hunter Thompson died of, and it's supposedly a suicide. I don't know if that's actually true. Hunter Thompson, one of the Hunter Thompson's sort of proteges and friends wrote in like a profile afterwards that he loved snuff film, that he had an affinity for snuff films. So there was some independent confirmation that he had indeed been involved in these activities. And yes, Hunter Thompson was known to socialize with Hal Hadden. He was one of Hadden's clients. So, all these interesting connections. And then more recently, Hal Hadden, representative of all people, Ghislaine Maxwell, in the case that Virginia Giuffre had
Oh,
filed
imagine
against.
that.
Yeah, very, very odd that he also shows up in the Epstein case defending Ghislaine of all people. And also, one of the things that I'd wanted to get into in the 9/11 episode but never got the chance to go into is the fact that he represented a man named Hamdan al-Turki, and Hamdan al-Turki was a Saudi national who had moved over to Denver and had been involved in publishing these radical Islamist sermons and materials. And ultimately, he was arrested on charges of keeping his maid as a sex slave. And his defense then was, well, this is okay to do in Islamic culture, to keep your maid as a sex slave. I'm being persecuted for my religion. I didn't break any laws. He was, of course, convicted because you can't do that in the United States.
Yes,
And
as it should be illegal.
yeah, and so he was imprisoned, and the Saudis were upset at this. They at one point had lobbied the Colorado Attorney General. Basically, the State Department under Bush lobbied the Colorado governor, who in turn lobbied the Colorado Attorney General, John Suthers, to go to Saudi Arabia and smooth things over. So already some improper influence was being exerted because al-Turki came from a prominent Saudi family. But a couple other things started to come out, which was, first of all, that Hamdan al-Turki had been in contact with the Hamburg cell in Germany, the people like Muhammad Atta and Marwan al-Sheikhi, who later came over to the U.S., supposedly planning the terrorist attack, but in reality being involved in drug running and other covert operations, as Daniel Hopsicker is well documented. So Hamdan al-Turki is in touch with the 9/11 supposed perpetrators who were involved in a drug ring with organized crime. And so basically, he's a pretty prominent, well-connected guy and a national security threat. But he hired, as his defense lawyer, Hal Hadden, to try and get a release or get a transfer back to Saudi Arabia. Hal Hadden was one of the people fighting for Hamdan al-Turki's release and to get transferred back to Saudi Arabia. And what ended up happening was the Colorado Department of Corrections Chief Tom Clements denies the transfer, and then within like a week of the transfer being denied, Tom Clements is found, he is murdered at his home. And the perpetrator of this crime is quickly found to be Evan Ebel, who is a white supremacist in the 211 crew, which is a big white supremacist gang in Colorado. He is considered by the Colorado authorities to be a lone nut, didn't do this with anybody else, even though evidence was mounting that he had done this at the behest of others in the 211 crew. A high-level leader, James Lord, basically ordered the hit on Tom Clements. And then in a very recent article from February of this year, it came out that Hamdan al-Turki was in prison with James Lore, and they were both discussing the hit against Tom Clements. So it appears it's now virtually undeniable that Hamdan al-Turki masterminded the assassination of a top government official in Colorado, and Hal Hadden is the one defending him. Hal Hadden, with his massive political connections to all over the Colorado establishment and even the U.S. establishment as well. He did Bill Clinton's taxes for Whitewater. So, all of these, this is the person who the Ramseys hired as their defense lawyer, and Hal Hadden and his team ended up making sure that the Ramseys were given very absurd, lenient treatment by the DA's office. They totally, they pretty much sabotaged any potential prosecution by allowing the Ramseys to get pretty much all of this confidential evidence. And so the DA's office was very much, improper in how they dealt with this case. And it gets far worse with the grand jury that I mentioned before. The I mentioned how the grand jury indicted the Ramseys on essentially charges of being an accomplice to whoever her murderer was. That they put her in a dangerous situation, allowing her to be abused, and then they covered for this person after the fact, which indeed matches a lot of the scenario, the facts and the evidence of the crime scene. The problem is that this indictment was handed down by the grand jury in 1999. However, Alex Hunter, the district attorney, ended up saying, well, the grand jury finished and I'm not filing charges. So, of course, he had led everyone to believe that there was no indictment because that was the most reasonable way to interpret a statement. But then it turns out that actually there was an indictment and Alex Hunter just hid it and then basically lied about it so that no one knew for 14 years that the Ramseys had been indicted. And I should know this is pretty much exactly what happened with the Rocky Flats scenario, where especially due to the influence of Hal Hadden, the grand jury wanted to indict these people, but instead the prosecutor decided against it and made sure that they were given a slap on the wrist for what happened. The same sort of situation with a Colorado grand jury is totally disregarded when they're on the right track, when they're getting too close to touching the people who are actually in power. So the whole way that the grand jury was handled is quite anomalous, and there's something else that's weird about it too, which has to do with an international child pornography ring called the Wonderland Club. And some people who have read Dave McGowan's book, Program to Kill, or read his series, The Pedophilicracy, will recognize when I talk about the Wonderland Club. It was this big international child porn operation that was, it operated in multiple nations, involved a lot of people, in the UK, in Germany, and of course the United States, all these countries really. And the Wonderland Club was busted in early September of 1998. And what is interesting is that pretty much within like a week of the Wonderland Club being busted, only then did Alex Hunter finally agree to convene a grand jury. There was plenty of time before that when the grand jury could have been convened and people wanted it to be convened, but it wasn't until the Wonderland Club raids happened that all these pedophiles were swept up, all the evidence was seized by the federal authorities, and that pretty much all the stuff was cleaned up, that the Boulder district attorney finally agreed to start the grand jury. And I find that timing very interesting, almost as if they were waiting for a cleanup operation to go on before they were willing to pursue this case at all. But what happened with the grand jury, is just the rot and corruption extended even into the next DA administration with Mary Keenan. Mary Keenan, the one who tried to break into the war room and apparently steal evidence from the police, was subsequently elected as the new district attorney of Boulder County. And she, again, took a very pro-Ramsey view. And in 2008, she even said that she decided to give a public exoneration of the Ramseys from any involvement in the crime. And she did this on the basis of DNA evidence. And while it is true that the DNA rules out the Ramseys from, while it's true that the DNA evidence rules out the Ramseys as being the killer because there was unidentified male DNA, that's not what they were indicted for. And Mary Keenan no doubt would have known that. She was basically Alex Hunter's deputy while the grand jury was going on, and then she literally was the district attorney. So how does she not know this? Of course she knows this. She must have known that the Ramseys were indicted on not as murderers, but as accessories to murder, and she decided to issue a public exoneration of them from murder, something they were never charged for. So of course she just continues the trend of trying to mislead the public in how all of this, went down. Her exoneration, while technically true, is totally empty when you realize 5 years later what the Ramseys were actually indicted for. And the DAs since Mary Keenan have not honestly been much better. Maybe they've even been worse if I'm being real about it. The next district attorney was Stan Garnett. And initially, Stephen Singular, who wrote the book Presumed Guilty that I mentioned, believed that Stan Garnett was a sincere person, that Stan Garnett really was interested in taking a fresh look at the case. And he decided to present Stan Garnett with some of the pedophile ring evidence that he had accumulated. And Stan Garnett seemed sincere at first, but then he basically kept telling Stephen Singular, oh yeah, talk to the Boulder police, liaison with them. Well, the Boulder police never showed any interest in any of these pedophile ring aspects. they never even showed much of an interest in John Ramsey. They pretty much only wanted to pin the crime on Patsy Ramsey or Burke Ramsey. So why is Stan Garnett just totally deferring to a Boulder police, an agency which has no interest in these pedophile suspects at all and has never shown any propensity to care about them? So Stan Garnett certainly doesn't seems to have not really been any better. And actually, he shows up in the Pat Sullivan case. For people who heard the 9/11 stream that I mentioned, the 9/11 stream that we did last year on November 9th, I talked about Pat Sullivan. He was the former sheriff of Arapahoe County. He turned out to be a pedophile, a sexual predator, a meth abuser who would go around, find young men and underage boys, give them meth, and use that to, basically to rape them, to reduce their ability to consent or take or say no, and then rape them. And he was even knowingly infecting people with HIV. He was a total monster, but he was powerful in Colorado law enforcement. He was super well respected, friends with Bush Sr. and Clinton, and was considered one of the best law enforcement officers, not just in Colorado but in the country. And there were a lot of whispers for a while that Pat Sullivan was up to no good, and were pretty much always ignored by the authorities. And one of these whispers was, from someone named Mark Seibel, who had also been involved in this white supremacist underground, this white supremacist and meth subculture that seems to be linked up with a lot of these Colorado pedophile operations. Mark Seibel had gone to Boulder District Attorney Stan Garnett in early 2011 and told Stan Garnett about some activities that Sullivan was involved in Boulder County. And Stan Garnett pretty much just passed the buck and gave it to some other task force, and then later said, well, there was nothing about Boulder that was really involved. Well, given the choice between believing Stan Garnett and all these other Colorado officials who seem to have a pattern of burying and covering up these cases, or believing Mark Seibel, who pretty much had nothing to gain and put everything on the line to blow the whistle about Pat Sullivan, I'm going to go with Mark Seibel, and that just makes Stan Garnett seem like, once again, he appears to have been involved in bearing evidence of the sexual predator Pat Sullivan, of activities that were going on in his jurisdiction. And then the DA after that, Michael Dougherty, is probably even worse than either of them, because Michael Dougherty was literally one of the two people to supervise the plea deal for Pat Sullivan. Pat Sullivan was given an absurdly light sentence for all of his crimes. He had two of his charges reduced. I think his charges of corruption of a public official, and maybe one of his sexual assault charges, like 2 out of his 4 charges were dropped in his plea agreement with these Colorado special prosecutors, one of whom was Michael Dougherty, and he was given less than a month to serve in jail for all that he did. They apparently didn't think that it was worth bringing him up on, abusing underage children or continuing to investigate this, of knowingly giving people HIV, of all of these things that Pat Sullivan did, that there were multiple witnesses attesting to. They pretty much just closed the books on this case as soon as possible. And then Michael Dougherty and his partner, who was also another Colorado State Attorney General's Office special prosecutor, Robert Shapiro and Dougherty tried to claim, rather absurdly, that Pat Sullivan got a very fair sentence, or even that he got a sentence that was harsher than most people would get. Well, yeah, maybe if you drop half of his charges, including the most serious of his charges, then yeah, he got a sentence that's equivalent to what a normal low-life street criminal would get. But it's impossible for them to justify the idea that Pat Sullivan was treated fairly and that justice was served in this case. But that is what they tried to insist. So Michael Dougherty, who was part of that cover-up of Sullivan's crimes, became the Boulder County DA. Meanwhile, Robert Shapiro, oddly enough, had actually been formerly working in the Boulder DA's office. He had joined the office right in 1996, right around the time JonBenet was killed, and he worked there until about 2007 before moving on to the Colorado Attorney General's office as a special prosecutor. Before that, Robert Shapiro had been in U.S. Army intelligence in Latin America, which is rather convenient as well. So ultimately, what I'm saying here is that all of these people in these institutions in Colorado are, it seems there's sort of a private club of people who are protecting pedophiles and protecting the organized crime operations, and they move around from agency to agency, and they show up in case after case, and they're all the same, really. They all they're all continuing to perpetuate a cover-up of these networks. And these are the kinds of people who show up on the fringes of the JonBenet Ramsey case. And finally, just want to get to mentioning the FBI as well. When the Ramsey case initially came to light, initially it was treated as a kidnapping, because that was what it appeared to be, with the ransom note saying that a small foreign faction had kidnapped John Ramsey's daughter. Now, here's just something to put in perspective. John Ramsey is a millionaire businessman. He is on the board of Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest defense contractors in the United States, and his daughter has supposedly been kidnapped by a small foreign faction. Now, that has got to raise massive alarm bells of a serious national security and terrorist threat. If you were taking it seriously as a real kidnapping, which people were at the time, then the FBI should have been on alert, as potentially a major terrorist operation has just gone down to kidnap this daughter of a defense contractor board member and businessman. Not to mention the fact that kidnapping falls under the FBI's jurisdiction under the Lindbergh Law. So the FBI should have been very much involved in this case from the very beginning as totally running things. It shouldn't have been possible for these inexperienced Boulder officers who were hung out to dry by the high-level command staff in their department, like Linda Arndt and Larry Mason and these others. It shouldn't have been possible for this situation of an understaffed police force, police officers who weren't given these resources to essentially have the crime scene get contaminated. The FBI should have been on the scene from the very beginning, taking charge of everything, and would not have allowed this to be an unsolved homicide. But for whatever reason, whether it was the FBI headquarters in Washington or the Boulder police somehow telling the FBI not to get involved, which is pretty unreal if true, why would the FBI listen to a small town police force anyway? Ultimately, somehow the FBI's behavior as well was very irregular, allowed the crime scene to be contaminated, and if professional investigators at the FBI had been involved from the very beginning, it would have been a lot harder to sabotage the key forensic evidence from this case and leave it in a position where it could probably never be prosecuted even to this day. So ultimately, every level of law enforcement, from the Boulder city and county officials all the way up to the FBI, had some role in sabotaging the investigation.
Now,
that's.
Now, I was going to say, George, the FBI would never do such a thing. They didn't do anything like that in the Finders case. Now, the FBI was 100% aboard and legit. Now, come on now. How dare you impugn the character of the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yeah,
they would never, they would never hide anything or never investigate as thoroughly as they should. They would never do anything like that now.
Yeah, I guess it is very irresponsible of me to ever say something like that. It's not as if the FBI has had a history of covering up evidence in the Kennedy assassination or the Franklin scandal or the Vince Foster investigation or the flight school in Venice, Florida, or any number of other things. And yeah, I mean, the thing with the FBI is that individual agents can and often are very sincere and good investigators, but at a higher level, the FBI is pretty much run by the same crooks who are involved in these networks to begin with, and they can affect a cover-up from on down. And that is personally what I suspect did happen in the Ramsey case, that the essentially high-level word came from Washington that they should not get involved in this case and leave it up to the local authorities to handle. And that would, of course, raise the question of why that would happen in the first place.
Yeah.
Why would they not be allowed to get involved in this case? Why would they not be allowed to have professional investigators make sure that the crime scene was secured, that the house was thoroughly searched, and that the police and that the parents would have been separated and interrogated separately immediately and put under pressure until they cracked, rather than allowing this, what's essentially been a massive cover-up, to get perpetuated. And, the difficult thing here, and I think this is the most important insight to understand about the Ramsey case, is that essentially the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder District Attorney's Office pushed two competing theories, but what they pushed two incomplete views of the case, both of which had certain things that were true and certain things that were false. And when you have these two organs of law enforcement split, you've pretty much polarized the narrative from the very beginning and made sure the case will never be solved. And that's the really troubling thing. You
Yeah.
have the Boulder police eager to pin it on a Ramsey, preferably Patsy Ramsey or Burke Ramsey, not John Ramsey, not willing to investigate any pedophile ring leads, no matter what. And we'll get more into why these into some of the most egregious problems in their conduct when we get into the specific pedophile ring accusations with this case. On the other hand, you have the Boulder County District Attorney's Office, which is totally deferential to the Ramseys' interests, making sure they have all the evidence from the case, potentially even breaking laws to get them evidence the police didn't want them to have, and covering for them when they were indicted on charges of accessory to the murderer. So you have one side pushing the Ramseys did it theory, you have the other side pushing an intruder and continuing to insist an intruder even despite the many problems with that claim. And so ultimately, yeah, the investigative arm of law enforcement wants to pin it all on the Ramseys and nobody else. The prosecutorial arm wants to pin it all on some nebulous intruder and no one else. And in the meantime, both of these agencies are totally stuck. They can't do anything without the other. Neither of them can get a complete view of the case because neither of them can accept that the other agency has some things that they're saying that are actually correct. The Boulder Police disputes the DNA evidence. The Boulder District Attorney's Office disputes all the evidence pointing to the Ramseys as being complicit. So this case is pretty much in standstill because they've totally, they've reduced it to a constant, controlled opposition essentially, where these two dueling establishment narratives are being put out for people to debate about endlessly, and you're just going to be stuck there until people are willing to put the pieces together and realize that both of these agencies are essentially stalling because truth the truth involves both the Ramseys and people outside the family, and that is the one road that nobody wants to go down, and that's the road that leads to the truth of this case.
Yeah, very, very much so. George, do you mind if I have you back in the next week or so for us to continue discussion on JonBenet Ramsey and for us also to discuss? We both watched the Contraland documentary, the documentary that Craig Salmon Sawyer finally put out, and you and I have been doing some research on that. Do you mind if I have you back in the next week or so for us to discuss
Yeah,
it?
yeah, that's fine. Unfortunately, the same thing happened with Operan too. I thought that I could cover the whole Ramsey case in one episode, but you never can. You pretty much are left with you try to just cover the stuff at the crime scene and the initial reaction of law enforcement, and then you realize you've taken 2 hours. Yeah, so I mean, I'd be glad to be back. I do just want to give people a snapshot of what we would discuss next
Yes, of
time.
course, of course.
I don't want to don't want to leave people think I'm just rambling on and on about law enforcement misconduct and not getting to the meat of what's actually here. I think it's important to establish the patterns of this case to see how similar they are to other things like Franklin. The way that law enforcement works to sabotage this case is for a very particular reason. And ultimately, there are so many pedophile suspects and people who were not looked at properly in this case. And I just want to give a quick overview of some of them. There was Randy Simons, who was a child pageant photographer of JonBenet Ramsey and other children. He and other children as well. He had reportedly asked one pageant mother to shoot nude photographs of her child. She refused, but there's no telling how many he didn't refuse. And ultimately, after the murder, he freaks out, flees town, keeps saying that he's being followed by paramilitary types trying to steal the photographic negatives. He's crying about how he doesn't have an alibi for JonBenet's murder. He essentially flips his lid, goes crazy, and he last year was in fact found to be in possession of child pornography. He was a pedophile, just as people kind of suspected for a long time. So that's one pedophile in close orbit of the Ramseys, never properly investigated by police, never taken seriously as a suspect or someone with knowledge. You have Bill McReynolds, the guy who played Santa Claus at the Christmas party on December 23rd, 3 days before JonBenet was killed. He has many other odd things about his background too, like a daughter who 22 years to the day that JonBenet was killed, had been kidnapped from her home along with a friend, supposedly had to watch her friend get sexually assaulted and then was released unharmed. He seemed to have a very odd obsession with JonBenet. And yeah, I mean, basically, so he was another odd character, never properly never really taken seriously. He was cleared by the police pretty quickly on. And then, of course, the biggest suspect of all, the most odd character in this whole scenario, is Fleet White. And Fleet White, like I said, is John Ramsey's best friend, an oil executive who did work for his father's oil company. His father, who went by the name Fleet White Sr., was a pretty long and well-established family. And Fleet White is many things. Fleet White is an obvious spook, I would say. Pretty much, I've talked to people, insiders who have investigated the Ramsey case, who all came to the same conclusion that, yeah, Fleet White is a spook. He's an intelligence asset. And in fact, one point when they try to hire a private investigator to investigate Fleet White, the PI totally freaked out after looking up Fleet White's name on a records computer and said, "I'm not touching this. You take your money back. If you look into this, it's at your own peril." So Fleet White was a big and dangerous guy, and he was John Ramsey's best friend. Fleet White he behaved very oddly at the crime scene, arguably even just as much or even more so than the Ramseys themselves. He and really what may have been the reason for his concern is the fact that he had been involved, along with his father and many other family members, in an intergenerational pedophile ring. And this intergenerational pedophile ring involving Nancy Krebs, basically a complaining victim named Nancy Krebs is the one who told the story. This pretty much in my opinion, broke the Ramsey case and really confirmed for the first time that all the suspicions about pedophile rings being involved were the truth. This woman, Nancy Krebs, came forward and accused Fleet White Sr., Fleet White Jr., and John Ramsey, among many others, of being involved in this long-time intergenerational pedophile ring, that she had been abused, that by the White family and by John Ramsey, put in child pornography films that were sold overseas, that John Ramsey had set up front companies to launder money for the sale of these pornography films.
Wasn't there child pornography found at Access Graphics?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting story. Unfortunately, only broke through the tabloids, but yes, according to a tabloid story that came out, and I'm inclined to believe it just because, the Ramseys were pretty litigious in a lot of ways in other tabloid stories, but they never sued them over this one.
And that's very interesting, is it not? Why would they not?
Yeah, the tabloid story said child pornography was found in the computers of Access Graphics, John Ramsey's company, which is, of course, a Lockheed Martin subsidiary, and taking
someone didn't want Discovery, did they?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And this company, Access Graphics, taking in $1 billion in revenue there's no real explanation of how it's getting that much money to begin with, really does fit with Nancy Krebs' claims about John Ramsey setting up these front companies to launder money for child pornography films. So Nancy Krebs' story, in my opinion, really ties together the full thing, explains why the Ramseys and the Whites and their friends would be behaving so bizarrely with each other. It's almost as if all of them had something to hide. And really, when you get down to it, this is one of these cases where all these people are suspicious. The Ramseys are suspicious. The Whites are suspicious. Bill McReynolds is suspicious. Pretty much all the major players, almost everyone who's been brought forth as a suspect in this case, has something anomalous about their behavior, and these connections really do go all over the place. Fleet White's a likely intelligence asset. That's Junior, that is. Fleet White Sr. has all sorts of prominent connections to people in Aspen, Colorado, and even to people in the Hollywood scene like Goldie Hawn. The Whites are super well connected. The Ramseys are well connected. All these people have connections going to the very top of our food chain. And when you get down to it, what happened in JonBenet Ramsey, in my opinion, is one of those intergenerational abuse rings with the complicity of the Whites and the Ramseys and all their elite friends. Just like what happened to Susan Hamlin, the same sort of network that seems to be involved with so many of these other families. JonBenet Ramsey and the Richard Hamlin case, both of the cases we've talked about tonight, are glimpses into a reality that most of us wouldn't even want to imagine was true. And yeah, next week I would be glad to pick it back up and do a in-depth, look into these pedophile ring aspects specifically. They really will go all over the place, and I think most people will be surprised to hear about a lot of this evidence because no one talking about the Ramsey case usually talks about this stuff.
No, not at all, George. I wanted to finish with the article that you sent me last night. By Kathy O'Brien. Trump, one of us. Trump is not one of us, my MK Ultra handler Alex Houston warned as he dropped me off inside the doors of Atlantic City's most opulent casino. It was 1985, and I was under robotic MK Ultra mind control orders to meet Reagan's attaché, Philip Habib, as detailed in Transformation of America. So, yeah, Kathy O'Brien, Trump's our guy. He's not one of them. Interesting, to my knowledge, and I took a brief look last night of about 20 or 30 minutes. Has she really mentioned this previously beforehand? You know...
No. It is rather convenient. I think that...
Well, rather coincidence.
I agree. The thing about these survivors like Kathy O'Brien and all these other people making these claims, unfortunately, there's a persistent pattern of these people. These are victims first and foremost. They want to find people who can advocate for them and support them. And unfortunately, these pedophile networks are so pernicious, so in depth in how they continue to worm their way into society that many of these victim advocates and these pedophile ring investigators and these so-called deprogrammers like Mark Phillips are really just part of the same network to draw survivors back in. And I mean, we see this pattern all over the place. I mean, someone like Lisa Bloom, for example, who pretends to be a Me Too feminist but is really representing these abusers and sabotaging cases like that of Katie Johnson.
Oh, no, that would never happen, George. How dare you say such a thing?
Yeah, and similarly with people like Mark Phillips, who supposedly rescued Kathy O'Brien, and of course immediately says, well, I found this attractive young woman who's been a sexual abuse victim since she was a child, time to have a sexual relationship with her and fall in lust or in love, as they would claim, with her, which just kind of rubs me the wrong way entirely. Yeah, I mean, Mark Phillips, the supposed rescuer and deprogrammer, who Kathy O'Brien even openly said, yeah, he worked for the CIA, but he's one of the good people at the CIA, one of the deprogrammers who didn't agree with this stuff. So almost all the time, unfortunately, these survivors tend to fall back into the clutches of these insincere people who are really just trying to, essentially draw them back into the fold, taint their narratives, and it happens over and over again with Paul Benassi as well. People like DeCamp and Gunderson are not trustworthy either, but they were the people who more or less handled Paul Benassi. So yeah, when Kathy O'Brien says that about Trump not being,
she never met Trump.
Yeah, she rather conveniently came up with this after just like completely now. It's never been substantiated before. It seems that it just fits the exact same political narrative that she and Mark Phillips were trying to push. They were very much, I wouldn't necessarily say CNP, directly, but they certainly their leanings.
They didn't name any of the secret right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was primarily the Clintons and the left-leaning CFR, liberal globalist establishment, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, that's the thing. They'll talk all about, I mean, the Bushes, they'll talk about the Clintons, they'll even bring up Reagan to an extent, although the funny thing, too, is that she actually claimed that Reagan was not as bad as the other people. She tried she tried to claim, I was abused by Reagan, but he seemed more remorseful, as if he was being forced to molest me.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
And look, we're not saying that there weren't horrible things done to Kathy O'Brien, and these people should be held accountable for it. Oh, that's not what we have. We feel bad for her. It's just, I don't know. There's some weird statements, and this.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, really. I think that, I do have sympathy for Kathy O'Brien, and I don't think that. I think there's a very good chance that she's not even being deliberately disinformational. I think that she's never really escaped the programming. I think that
and I think they've pushed her in certain directions. It's very sad. The same thing some people could say that's happening to Virginia Roberts Giuffre. So.
Right. I think with Kathy O'Brien, the fact that she's been abused is hard to dispute. At one point, they literally even found a video. There was a video of a vaginal exam of hers where they found that like a devil's face had been carved in there. So it's hard to it's hard to deny that she was abused quite horrifically. But an Mark Phillips is not, a good person, not an advocate. And Kathy O'Brien, her story in fact parallels much of what happened with both JonBenet and her mother Patsy Ramsey. And next week we should hopefully get into that too, because there are some very startling parallels. The Michigan pedophile ring connections to North Fox Island, with Francis Sheldon, and
Mm-hmm.
the fact that John Ramsey's father was heading the Michigan Aeronautics Commission during that time, the fact that Patsy Ramsey, she grew up in West Virginia, where Kathy O'Brien's supposed handler Robert Byrd came from, and Patsy Ramsey even went to events with Robert Byrd, and that Patsy Ramsey herself was an apparent sexual abuse victim, and said to have a very programmed and controlled demeanor. There's so much out there that with the Ramsey case, and it parallels all these other cases, and really Kathy O'Brien, Susan Hamlin, JonBenet Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, all these people, in my view, are they're
Multi-generational.
yeah, they're victims of a sick network that goes on throughout the generations, and the abuse essentially gets passed on constantly.
Yeah.
And it's sickening to realize, but that's the truth behind these cases. And when we come back next week or whenever, we will delve a lot more into that and talk about how what happened in JonBenet is not just localized to Boulder, not just localized to one family, but really indicts the entire Colorado power structure and the entire U.S. and global power structure too.
Yeah, and you and I are going to name names here, but just I want to get this on the record. Look out for more people to come up and mention that Trump ain't one of them either. More sexual abuse survivors. Look at and survivors of these pedophile networks. Look out for that to happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look out, and also look out for some sort of Pizzagate 2.0 to. Maybe Corona may have changed that, but I still hear it out in the internet ether. Look for another Pizzagate 2.0 to drop sometime around the election, I believe. It may be against Trump. It may be whoever Trump's running against to hinder them. We shall see. And We're not saying that there were not true elements to Pizzagate. I mean, you and I both are not saying that at all when we say that. We're just saying that it was. It seems to be in accordance with the reporting of Yoshi Shiramatsu, that Roger Stone and WikiLeaks timed that release to cripple the public opinion of Hillary Clinton, from what I've seen. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the important thing to realize. True information can still be weaponized for political gain, and very often is. That's the that's the lesson with something like Pizzagate, where you can accept that the claims inside have elements of truth to them, but you can also realize that they're being used for more purposes than just to expose the truth, that they're being used to help someone out. That's and that's the same thing, with some of these narratives in the JonBenet Ramsey case, when they expose certain things like, expose the pageants, it all gets fed back into another establishment narrative. It what happens to JonBenet just serves to make people more and more scared and disgusted. Either you have the specter of a marauding intruder going around, and people should be living in fear of that, or you realize that you live in a country where such a sickening thing as a parent or a brother killing their child can happen. If those are the two narratives you believe, people are just primed into thinking that the human condition is horrible, and thinking that it's all just any ordinary person could snap and be like this. You can't trust anyone around you because all of them have this potential darkness inside. When in reality, it's not I think people by and large are good. It's not that humans are some terrible group. It's that a certain small minority who happens to be in charge and powerful is terrible, and
Yes.
they're trying to spread that darkness around and make us believe that the darkness lies with each other, so that we won't work with each other rather than focusing attention on them.
Now, yeah, my belief as a Christian, it's Satan that's driving it. But it's definitely there is Satan, and there's also the evil that men do. You can't excuse self will and the evil that men can do too as well. Just like we can do good because we were made in the image of our Creator. So yeah, it's I see that, and I see the disinfo that will be put out, just like with Pizzagate, where you have a lot of truth. James Alefonsis and David Brock being extremely sketchy, and the Lozado family, and everything. So yeah, you had a lot, but you also had a lot of disinformation that came out through, and Podesta brothers too being very sketchy, and all of them need to be investigated. Disinformation being put out to muddy the waters as well, like the scars on Podesta's hands. You actually look at the WikiLeaks emails that I've talked previously beforehand, that it was from him having a medical condition called Dupuytren's contracture. And Dupuytren's contracture, he had surgery, exactly where the scars would be on his hands for. And so, yeah, I mean, that when you have an op being put on the American public, like the release of Pizzagate was, and there were genuine researchers who were trying to hold these people accountable, just like we had with Franklin or the finders or anything else. You had genuine researchers, and you had disinfo agents or operatives being in the mix. It is no difference for Pizzagate, and it'll be no different from Pizzagate 2.0. Whatever it may be called at the time. Some people in the chat are saying Biden Gate. I could see that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's already with the terror accusation already, and I'm not going to say one way or another or anything. And we know that Biden is a creep. The thing is, like I said, a lot of these accusations can be weaponized, even if they are true. And it is interesting. I think that it did come out right around the time that Biden had pretty much thrown up the nomination. Like, sometimes the stuff is timed for maximum political damage, even when it is true. So that's something to look out for. And I think with all these sexual abuse and pedophile ring cases, we just need to be rigorous in how we approach it. That just because it's something that we want to hear does not automatically mean that it is true. That you have to go straight to the documentation and see if what you think is true is actually backed up. And especially next week with the JonBenet Ramsey case, I hope to do that and share a lot of the new documents that I've come up with recently, implicating people like Paul Schultz and these other pedophile groups in Colorado and Texas. So, yeah, for everyone listening, there's a lot more coming out soon on JonBenet and others. I hope people are looking forward to it and doing well in the meantime, and just staying vigilant and following what's going on.
Yes, very much so. Thank you for coming on, George. We'll have you on next week to continue your excellent coverage, being the foremost modern investigative journalist into the JonBenet Ramsey murder case, and child abuse ring cover up. And we're also probably going to discuss Contraland too as well. So anybody out there, everybody out there, Craig Saltman Sawyer dropped the Contraland documentary, so definitely watch it in preparation for us discussing it next week. Take care, George. Glad to have you on again, brother. Talk to you again soon.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Glad to be back.
All right, everybody. That's it. Hope you guys. I want to say I hope you guys enjoyed the show, but it's a very tragic and difficult subject. So hope you guys found the show informative, I guess would be the right way of saying it. I want to thank George for coming on. George is an excellent researcher and a dear friend, and one of the few people that I trust completely with my research, and he does the same. So that's it for this episode of Dudes Talking, episode 58. JonBenet Ramsey and Sid Siemer revisited with George from cavdev.org. Next show is going to be Sunday. Secret Right Roundtable, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with Neil Sanders, Greg McCarran from The Antidote, and Recluse. So look forward to that. We are going to be discussing the Council for National Policy, the John Birch Society, the American Security Council, Los Raquel, and Cambridge Analytica. So yes, and then next week, this Sunday will be a stream of Free to Captives on conservatives on the Secret Right and their infiltration, and then after that will be so Sunday you're going to get two shows, and then next week Interview with Ed Offerman on Saturday about McMartin Preschool and Debbie Nathan and his involvement in the Katie Johnson case as the private investigator. I can't wait to speak with Ed again. And I think that's it. John and Lee show on Wednesday to be determined. I might have a stream Monday evening on Judith Reisman. I'm gonna bring some very interesting information to the table about her. I might hold that off, however, because I might try to interview Judith Reisman. I think that's about it. And so, as always, till next time, always read the documents. George and I do, or do our best to try to. Take care, everyone. God bless you. Have a good evening.